to everybody, and my thanks goes to Hassan bin Mohammed Center, of course, and to Mohammed Merakten for his kind invitation, and to have suggested also this interesting topic, which I had great pleasure to address. My communication on dating systems and calendars among the Minaeans is divided into three parts. In the first, I will discuss the systems of dating referring to rulers, as well as those using eponyms. Then I will briefly point out how the division of seasons was conceived. And finally, I will discuss what we know about the Minaean annual calendar and its division of months, also considering new information coming from the recently published Minaic documents in Zabur script. It is important to note that it will not always possible to distinguish the evidence relating to the pre-Minaean, historically speaking, or Madhabian phase from the proper Minaean phase, but I will attempt to do so when appropriate. So, throughout the first millennium BCE, before the era systems were conceived in South Arabia, the dating system was set up mainly through eponyms, as we know, was real function beyond the association with a particular temporal sequence we know very little about. As already pointed out by Beeston a few years ago, it seems rather surprising that a dating system associated with the successive regnal years of the sovereigns was not systematically established in South Arabia. This would not have been any more difficult given how frequently kings are mentioned, at least in South Arabian public monumental inscriptions. However, the Minaean region itself offers a partial exception. We are unaware if this is due to internal or foreign inspiration. In the Jove area, in fact, several inscriptions present a temporal link to the reigning monarch, without, however, specifying the year of the reign. For instance, they state that such a construction or dedication or offering was made biome, that is, in the day or at the time of a particular ruler. Or of the 40 or so inscriptions that show this formula, selected also with the help of the DASI database, we see that the vast majority are archaic, hence Madhabian. The inscriptions, the provenance of which we know, mostly come from Karnaw, but also from Kamna, Haram, and Nashan, when they were still independent, and they refer to local rulers, although not all of them, as we see here in the list, are mentioned with a royal title. Moreover, inscriptions from the second half of the first millennium BCE that employ this formula are significantly fewer. There are only roughly a dozen of instances, and they are distinguished by the orthographic variant marking the designator of the state construct, and in a couple of cases also the word yom, as we see here, appears in scriptio defectiva without the medial wow. In certain instances, this temporal indicator occurs in the middle of the text rather than at the end, depriving it of the prominent place that such information is typically expected to occupy. As many as 3 of the few instances that at this time use this formula come from Alula, making the record from the motherland even more rare. The sarcophagus of Saqqara is one of the most important inscriptions in which this formula appears. It states that the deceased Minaean merchant was conducting big business in Egypt in the time of Ptolemy, the son of Ptolemy, which appears to be an exact replica of the formula found in the earliest Minaic inscriptions. It is noteworthy, though, that the text ends with a more exact date, expressed instead according to the local custom, month of Hoyak in the year 22 of Ptolemy the king. The well-known inscription from the walls of Marrakech that shows the Minaean Katabanian synchronism may be the final example of this temporal specification. It can be argued that this tradition first emerged in the Jove city-states at the beginning of the first millennium, but it only persisted in a small number of monumental inscriptions during the Minaean kingdom's apogee. Naturally, the mention of sovereigns continued throughout Minaic inscriptions, but only in dedication or invocation, lacking any temporal significance, though they are, of course, of great chronological insignificance to us. This chronological reference to the monarch is occasionally supplemented in some archaic inscriptions by the identification of an eponym, which quickly emerged as the primary dating method. In the Minaean context, this is entrusted to the office called Kabīr, which literally means great. It must have had essentially administrative rather than religious purposes, given its frequent association with city names or public activities. The indication of the Kabīr in the monumental texts does not appear to have a set form. It may be introduced by a temporal phrase, Yom Kabīr, or through a relative phrase, Du Kabīrah, or simply by a preposition. The indication of the Kabīr thus serves to identify a given period, presumably 1 year, but sometimes the month can also be specified when a more precise dating is needed. We shall go back to this at the end. The function of the Kabīr could, however, be renewed at least for a second term, and in this case it is specified whether the eponym is at the first year of his Kabīrate or at the second, with the number Thanai. There is also one case, but is not very clear, Haram 11 here, where probably the eponym served 3 years. The use of the eponym with the title Kabīr seems specific to the Minaean area, since it does not occur elsewhere in South Arabia, even though the title was still known, and as in Saba and Kataban, for instance, but there the eponym is usually referred to as Harif. Regarding this, an intriguing feature of the non-Sabaic stick inscriptions from the Jove Valley is that, in accordance with the Sabaean custom, only the Harif eponym is mentioned, rather than the eponym Kabīr. Additionally, it should be mentioned that most of these documents, roughly 25 in total, fall within paleographic stages that span most of the central part of the first millennium BC. However, few of these documents are archaic, and some of them also exhibit Sabaic influences on a linguistic level, suggesting that this type of eponymate may actually be of Sabaean origin. The nomenclature also varies from the one employed in the monumental texts dated by Kabīr eponyms. The word Arat, for example, is occasionally used in conjunction with the Harif, which hypothetically may indicate an additional term of office. It is also occasionally used in Sabaic inscriptions, again in connection with the Harif, and is frequently understood as deputy, eponym, or substitute, but the meaning of this term is not clear at all for the moment. From a first analysis of the stick documentation in Minaic languages, emerges that individuals serving as Harif eponym do not show onomastic comparisons with those that we find mentioned as Kabīr in the monumental documentation. But it is noticeable that among the eponym Harif, some members of the Faran lineage are mostly recurring. It is likely, in fact, that there were two distinct offices, the Kabīr and the Harif, especially if we consider that the two documents, Musnad and Zabur, usually pertain to two alternative contexts, dedication and public activities as far as the monumental texts are concerned, legal or economic records of private relevance in the case of the text on sticks. Now, a brief interlude devoted to the seasons, where I take up some information I have already presented in my 2020 article on seasonal offerings. On that occasion, I had studied the arrangement of the offertory tables in the two temples of Barakish, Nakrach and Athar Dukat, that have seasonal names, observing how the alternation of seasons reflected in the religious ritual and consequently in the organization of the space in both temples. In the temple dedicated to Athar Dukat, it was in fact possible to bring to light all four offertory tables that occupy most of the hypostyle hall in front of the central cella, organized into as many cenacles. Each of these tables has on its frontal side an ibex frieze and a label designating the season whose harvest was plausibly to be offered at that corresponding table. The first two terms are well known, particularly Kharif, autumn, which is also connected to the major summer rainfall. As Biston well explained, this term also came to refer to the entire year, named after the most significant and certainly most awaited climatic event. The same term was also used to identify the annual eponym, as we have just seen. Also clear is the term Ditha, which instead identifies the minor spring rains, and with which Kharif is in fact always or often found in pairs. The term Daith is specific Minaic for summer. Its meaning can also be established on etymological grounds, while in Sabaik other terms are employed for the summer season, for example Sasa or Qaid. Concerning the newly attested Yagul, its attribution to winter proceeds by exclusion. Here too, the term for winter is different from the terminology we find in Sabaik. As anticipated, the corresponding winter table in the temple of Nakrach has not been found due to a very peculiar situation which is worth noting. In the temple of Nakrach, the corresponding space that in the temple of Athar is occupied by the summer table was modified to create a passage to the external so-called sacristy, which required the elimination of the table standing there. But the summer table in the temple of Nakrach was not dismissed, but it was instead moved to the place of the winter table, which in turn was the one eliminated. It is therefore quite surprising that when faced with the need to remove a table, the conscious choice was to sacrifice the one related to the winter offerings. Now we move to the last dating category, the month, which, as in the rest of South Arabian, is identified generically by the word warq. Regarding the names of the months in the Minaic text, I have so far been able to compile a list of 14 months that takes into account certain additions from the newly published monumental inscriptions, as well as the new data coming from the stick documents recently made available. Three more alleged month names for Minaic are included in Stein's second volume of the Munich collection, but out of caution I decided not to consider them here because they are still apaxes from a couple of sticks that are hard to read and they are not defined by the term warq. It should be noted, though, that it would not be surprising if we arrive at a number of months above the dozen in the Minaic lexicon, as it may be expected that some pre-Minaean city-states, like Nashan, for example, had month names that differed at least in part from those that were later codified under the kingdom of Mine. And this is an instance in which we should, in fact, pay attention to distinguish the Madabian documentation from the Minaic one, but it's not possible to do always, or I was not able to do yet now. This alphabetic list, as you see, gathers all the names of the months that are relevant for the Minaean region. Normally, all of these are preceded by the relative pronoun thu, which is omitted here. The occurrences provided here for each month make it possible to also observe the regular opposition in these date formulas. Here they are all the attestation of the months names in Minaic documentation. And it's possible to observe the regular opposition in these date formulas between the two systems of eponym, according to the different colors. The purple is stick documentation, the blue is Alula, the black is monumental inscriptions from Jof Valley, from Yemen. Okay, and so we see that two different eponyms, the two systems of eponym that are concurring in the dating systems of the two documentations. The list allows us to make some observation. First of all, we see that some of these names are also shared with other South Arabian languages, as you see here. For example, Abhai is found in both Sabaic and Katabanic with a slightly variant. Duathar or Salam are also recorded in the calendar of Amir tribe. In the latter case, of course, with the modification of the sibilant, of the merging of the sibilant, which is totally expected. The months Hadar and Tardahai are also found in Sabaic, with the latter also occurring in Adramitic with a variant. Most of these months appear repeatedly in both the monumental and sticks records, indicating that the same kind of calendar was utilized. It's not at all surprising for both typologies of documents. Only a few months are attested in one or the other documentary group, but this, of course, can be fortuitous for the moment because of the scant documentation we have still. Concerning the month Abarhan, we observe that it's never mentioned as Warh, but its function is guaranteed by its inclusion in the Kabīr formula. The Minaic inscriptions from Alula also use nomenclature that is now attested in the inscriptions of the motherland, both Musnad and Zabur, thus demonstrating that the Minaean community of Dedan used its own calendar when writing text there. As we know, this was not the case, we have seen just a few moments ago, in the Saqqara sarcophagus, where instead the local calendar was used, citing the two Egyptian months, Hathor and Hayak, regrettably without providing equivalence with the corresponding Minaean months, a datum that would have been very useful for us. Now that the month Salam is well attested in the cursive documentation, I believe this could be a good integration also for the mutilated occurrence of a month beginning with the same sibilant in the monumental inscription M388. According to their names, we can recognize some recurring semantic groups, name of deities, festivities, and some natural phenomena. Although the evidence is not conclusive, it may be possible to identify the specification of an intercalary month, this is just hypothetical, with the addition of the word haratan, which occurs in a couple of examples just added to the month Tanfatam. But we await, of course, further confirmation in this regard. I conclude addressing a couple of issues that are crucial to our discussion today, specifically how was the Minaean month structured? Did it have decades as well? Lastly, is there any way to identify the various Minaean months? Regarding the first problem, the division into decades, I'm inclined to give an affirmative answer, because when mentioned, the number of the day of the month is never greater than 9. Although happening very rarely in the Minaic documentation, this is at least a noteworthy indicator, as we see here in 3 examples. So the day is the 5, the 6, or the 9, with never above 9. However, how were the 3 decades specified? Each Sabaic decades, as we saw also yesterday with Mohammed Merakten, had its own name. So it's possible that Minaic had 2. The last example here can help us in this regard. Here the term Shahr is used, which in some Semitic languages, as we know, Arabic as well, it also employed to indicate the entire month. and in the first instance, I also interpreted also these instances in that way. But I'm now inclined also to consider it in an alternative way. Shaher can also, in fact, more specifically designate the new moon that does sometimes believed to indicate the South Arabian, the first day of the month, which is not certainly the case of the first example, because the day is the 9. So considering this, an alternative possibility is that Shaher here defines the first decade. Concerning the third decade, there are a couple of instances where the term Akbai is used before the month. This lemma is connected to the third decade in Sabaic and most likely in Katabanic as well, so we can admit the same function here as well. The second decade remains to be identified, but reasoning by exclusion, we could perhaps attribute this function to the single occurrence of the term Ta'an. As for the last question, and I'm concluding, concerning the identification of the Minaean months, we lack solid and comprehensive evidence. However, a first possibility could come from the name of the month itself, as perhaps in the case of Bakar Ditha, which is maybe connected to the spring season. Then it is also possible to ask whether the Minaean and Sabian months that share the same name also had the same temporal collocation. As already noted by Christian Robin in 2017, the calendars of South Arabia in the first millennium BC were probably less differentiated than their rather dissimilar nomenclature would imply. Thanks to the correlation provided by the Sabian Nabatean bilingual of Sirwach and the month sequences recorded in some Sabaic inscriptions, the temporal equivalence of the month in the Sabian calendar is now quite clear. For instance, we know that the Sabian month Du Athar was supposed to fall between November and December. However, is it possible that this also applies to the corresponding Minaean month? Because of its placement in situ, this inscription from the temple of Athardukabt in Barakish, which regulates the preparatory rites to be carried out in the 9th day of the month Du Athar that we have seen a few moments ago, provides an intriguing hint. This text is in fact engraved on one of the pillars inside the hall, the one next to which the winter table is also standing. Thus probably at the exact spot where this operation were to take place if the month Du Athar actually fell at the beginning of the winter season. Thank you very much for your attention.